If a country were to use a nuclear bomb right now, how much damage would it cause to the entire world? And could it ever happen? Well, we know that nuclear weapons are dangerous. We know that they're incredibly powerful, but how much damage could one single nuke do in the modern world? First of all, before we talk about the blast and the radiation and all that stuff, let's talk about the explosion itself. It'd be pretty massive. One nuke could level an entire city block or several of them, depending on the strength of the weapon. And we're not just talking about buildings being destroyed here. We're also talking about infrastructure, like water mains, power lines, and sewers being affected by the heat and the light alone from the explosion. If you want to see what this might look like, all you have to do is check out some footage of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. These are obviously a lot smaller than the bombs that we have available to us today, but they still give us a good idea of the kind of destruction that a nuclear blast can cause, especially considering that these bombs were dropped on heavily populated civilian areas. So if a country were to drop one of these bad boys on an area that was unprepared for a nuclear blast, the death toll could easily be in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Radiation aside, the explosion and the immediate aftermath would make it hard for emergency services to get to the victims in time, especially if the nuke went off in a major population center. Things would be even worse if the country targeted a major transportation hub, a dam, or some other infrastructure that was essential to the country. Of course, when most people think of a nuclear attack, they aren't thinking about the immediate explosion at all. Instead, their minds go to the long-term effects of nuclear fallout. But how long does nuclear fallout actually affect an area? Well, that depends on a lot of factors. How strong was the bomb? How far away was it from major population centers? What kind of winds were blowing at the time the bomb exploded? What kind of terrain does the fallout have to travel over? All of these things play a role in determining how long the fallout will remain dangerous. Obviously, if a bomb explodes very close to a major population center, then it'll be dangerous for a longer period of time, because there's more people there to affect. Also, if the bomb explodes high in the air, then the fallout will be spread along the wind patterns and affect a larger area for a longer period of time. This is why it's so important for a nuke to detonate well above the ground. The further away the explosion is from the ground, the better, because then the blast wave and the radiation will dissipate a lot faster. This is why the United States set up Operation Castle Bravo. Operation Castle Bravo was a series of nuclear tests conducted in the Pacific Ocean between July of 1954 and March of 1958. They were designed to test various aspects of nuclear weapons, such as the ability to withstand underwater explosions and the effectiveness of different types of nuclear warheads. Now, one of the tests, Castle Bravo, which took place in July of 1954, was supposed to be a low-yield test with a nuclear device that had been pulled from active duty. The test was designed to study the effects of radiation on personnel in the surrounding area. But something went wrong with the device, and instead of producing the expected 6 megatons of energy, it exploded with a force equal to about 15 megatons of TNT. The explosion blast was so powerful that it destroyed the nearby islands of Runit Island and Anatahan Island and contaminated a large part of the Pacific Ocean with radioactive fallout. 3 crewmen aboard the ship that monitored the explosion were killed by acute radiation sickness, and many others were injured. In fact, fallout from the explosion reached Japan and put thousands of people at risk. So imagine if this explosion had happened at the height of the Cold War. Now, it's safe to say that there's been some progress in nuclear technology since the 1950s, but that's not saying much considering how primitive our nukes were back then. Imagine if 2 superpowers had gotten into a huge disagreement and one of them had decided to launch a nuclear strike against the other one. The blast and the immediate aftermath would have caused widespread destruction and loss of life, and the nuclear fallout would have spread across the world. Radiation levels would have spiked all over the planet, and food supplies would have become contaminated. The entire world would have been thrown into chaos, and the nuclear fallout would have continued to affect people for years to come. People would have to deal with increased rates of cancer and other health problems for decades after the explosion, and the environment would have been contaminated for generations to come. Now, even though we've come a long way since the 1950s, we still don't know exactly what would happen if a nuke were to go off in the middle of a densely populated area. That's because we've never done it on purpose. There's never been a nuclear detonation in a major population center. So while we can make educated guesses about the potential consequences of such an event, we can't be sure what would happen. However, we do know that it would be devastating both in the short and long term. In terms of the short-term effects, we can look to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for some clues. Both cities were largely destroyed, and thousands of people were killed immediately from the blast and the ensuing fires. Nuclear fallout also began almost immediately, and within a few weeks, tens of thousands more had died from radiation poisoning. Even today, there are still elevated levels of cancer and other health problems in the areas around Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In terms of the long-term effects, we can look to the Chernobyl disaster for some clues. While Chernobyl was a nuclear accident rather than a deliberate attack, the effects are similar. The radiation from Chernobyl has been shown to have caused thousands of cases of cancer and other health problems, not only in the people who were exposed to high levels of radiation, but also in the general population. There's no doubt that a nuclear detonation in a major population center would be devastating in both the short and long term. Not only would thousands of people be killed or injured, but the radiation would contaminate the surrounding areas, making them stuck for generations to come. The answer to the second part of the question, could it ever happen, is also yes, it could. Could it happen today? Absolutely. There are plenty of countries around the world that have nuclear weapons, and any one of them could theoretically use one today. North Korea has tested nuclear weapons recently and has threatened to use them against its enemies. Pakistan and India have nuclear weapons, and the two have a long history of hostility towards each other. Russia and the United States have the vast majority of the world's nuclear weapons, and both have engaged in nuclear saber rattling. Any one of these countries could use a nuclear weapon against another country or against civilian targets. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible. It's important to remember that nuclear weapons are not like regular weapons. They're not something that can be used to achieve military objectives without causing massive civilian casualties and environmental damage. If a country were to use a nuclear weapon against another country, it would be seen as an act of war and would likely lead to retaliation. It would also trigger a global response from the international community. But ultimately, the decision of whether or not to use a nuclear weapon is up to the country that possesses it. There are no international laws or treaties that prohibit countries from using nuclear weapons. And even if there were, countries like North Korea have shown that they're willing to break the rules if it means achieving their goals. The bottom line is that we should never use nuclear weapons. They're too dangerous and indiscriminate to ever be considered a viable military option. But the possibility of a nuclear detonation occurring accidentally is always present. Human error or equipment failure could cause a nuclear weapon to be detonated unintentionally. And the consequences of such an event would be just as devastating as if it had been done intentionally. Hopefully, we can learn from the mistakes of the past and work towards a world where nuclear weapons are eliminated. But until that happens, we need to be prepared for the possibility of a nuclear detonation and the devastating consequences that would follow. So, do you think it could ever happen today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out more content.